Professor Deason. Thank you very much for your time. Let's talk in general about Trump and China. How was this trip received in Europe? What do you think his goals were? What do you think he accomplished at all, if anything?
No, I don't think he accomplished much at all, but it is interesting to observe what he hoped to achieve based on where the disinformation comes in. Because, with China, some of the main stories we got were, it seemed as if China was falling in line, essentially bowing to U.S. pressure and putting pressure on Iran. So the first and I think most important commentary, which came from the Trump administration and then disseminated through the media, was that the Chinese wanted the Strait of Hormuz to be opened. Now, this sounds a bit like giving support for the United States, because the U.S. defines its mission as opening up the Strait of Hormuz. But to have open access for China, it doesn't mean that the U.S. should prevail. Indeed, the Chinese don't have access anymore to Venezuela. They don't have access to Cuba. So the idea that an American victory and conquest would result in open access for China, it's not correct. And indeed, I think the Chinese access can be achieved in cooperation with Iran. So, but you also saw a similar comment being made about the nuclear weapons. That is, China now supports the U.S. position that Iran should have no nuclear weapon. But this was also not very controversial. Iran itself says it doesn't want nuclear weapons. No country in the world wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, which is why the Iranians have in the past accepted these intrusive inspections under the JCPOA agreement. But also the idea that Iran would give up all its enriched uranium, this is also false. There's no way they would do this. And at most, perhaps there could be a deal where the Russians would hold on to it. But essentially, it is interesting because you get an impression of the image or the narrative which the Trump administration wants to spin, and that's interesting on its own. But I don't think he achieved what he wanted to, and I think that was also predictable, because the main goal, I think, of this meeting was for Trump to show up after having defeated Iran. Instead, he comes weakened, as most now recognize this war is being won by the Iranians. So I don't think he got any of the things he wanted, but he was treated with respect. The Chinese don't want to have any tensions with the US, given that the competition is a very sensitive point at the moment.
Yeah. It was odd because you know this from your work. Normally, when there are visits of this nature, there are agreements hammered out to and agreed behind closed doors in advance, and then the heads of state sign something and ratify the agreements, and then there's a joint communique issued by both foreign ministries, in our case, the Department of State, so that there's no dispute as to what was agreed to. None of that happened. Nothing was agreed to ahead of time. Trump didn't even know who was greeting him on the tarmac. For some reason, it was expecting President Xi. Is this the wish of the Chinese, the laziness or unorthodoxy, whatever you want to call it, of the Trump State Department?
Yeah, let's go with unorthodoxy. Well, I think that Trump, I think he sees himself as being, the great deal maker. So I think he wants to negotiate himself. He puts a lot of weight on establishing good friend relations, personal relations with the other leaders, and then this is essentially how you open up for trust and getting a good deal. But you're right, this might be how it works in real estate, but it's not how it works in politics. In politics, you send out your diplomats, your Sherpas. They will prepare the meetings in advance. They will try to hammer out a deal, and essentially when it's pretty much already done, that's when the state leaders would come in and go through the formalities. But the idea that the foreign leaders themselves will negotiate, I think this is this is not how diplomacy is usually done. So no, so it does seem unprofessional for many people who are used to observing the diplomacy. But for Trump, he might favor this word, as you said, unorthodox. So perhaps he perceives this to be a better way of doing political deals. But
right.
But this can be objectively measured, and he's not achieving any deals. He didn't get any deals with the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese. So I don't think the deal making in real estate is transferable to the world of politics.
I think he thought he could get the Chinese to pressure Iran to surrender nuclear enriched material, even that which they use for civilian purposes. And I'm sure that President Xi, it's easy to draw this conclusion because there was no announcement made. I'm sure President Xi said, we're not going to have any part of it. Well, can you get Iran to open up the Strait of Hormuz? No, it's their territory, Donald. It's not ours, and it's not yours. I'm mimicking what the conversation could have been like. I know President Xi is the quintessential diplomat. I doubt he called him Donald, and I doubt he snapped back at him. But surely Donald Trump did not get even minimally what he expected to. In fact, when he was asked by Sean Hannity, what did you accomplish? He said, well, we cemented the personal relationships. That's probably true.
Yeah, but that sounds like a sales call where you you just build up the original good relations before you go on to the diplomacy. But the good relations on its own doesn't do much in the world of diplomacy unless it results in some actual deals. Don't get me wrong. I think actually the ability of Trump to meet with other leaders and that this is one of his big strengths, to be honest, because well, if you look at the Europeans, they refuse to even talk to the opponents. They behave like 12-year-old girls in the schoolyard. They're trying to freeze out the other side. Let's stop talking to them. So the fact that Trump, he's quite unique in this. He's the only one, for example, who could go and meet with Kim Jong-un, for example. This is unthinkable for any other leader. He's also, after 4 years, or well, then it was 3 years of boycotting diplomacy with the Russians, he was able to essentially meet with Putin, withstand the pressure. It's not everyone who's able to do this in the West because we kind of criminalize diplomacy. The idea is that you shouldn't talk to the opponent if you disagree with them because you legitimize them. I mean, all this nonsense, he can cut through this. So there's something to this, though, that he's able to build relations. But that can't be the only thing. It has to actually be something tangible. And it appears to me what he wanted from the Chinese the most was for them to, well, in the hope of cementing better relationship with the United States, that they would put pressure on or turn their back on either Russia or Iran. But again, this will be very self-destructive for the Chinese. And I think they know what Trump is after. That is essentially what challenges the U.S. empire is the integration of the greater Eurasian space. That is the growing cooperation between countries like China, India, Russia, Iran. And if you can cause a division between them, then that's an achievement on its own. But that's why you're not going to see this anymore. They're not going to turn their backs on their partners in Eurasia. And again, you can often excuse a lot of Western politicians for believing that this is possible. For example, in the 90s and the 2000s, when the Russians were aspiring to integrate into this common European home, they often viewed their relationship with the Iranians or the Chinese as some sort of political currency, and to increase their own market value, a relationship they could trade away if they thought that they would be embraced and integrated into the West. But that was in the past. The main strategy of the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, others, is to pursue prosperity by setting up a new economic architecture which is organized in the East. So that makes them each other's most important partners. So the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, they're not going to turn on each other. And
right. Is there any question in your mind about that wealth and power geopolitically is moving eastward on the globe?
Oh yeah, no. Well, this is both observable and measurable. The geopolitical point of gravity is shifting to the east. The economic power is shifting to the east, and you don't only measure this in GDP. You can measure this in most of the main pillars of the economic architecture. Now, I often compare what the Chinese are doing and the Russians are doing to what the Americans themselves were doing when they were trying to gain more political and economic independence from the British. That is, after the Americans obtained their independence, people like Alexander Hamilton recognized that if the U.S. wanted to maintain its political independence, it also needed economic independence. So the American system developed with people such as Henry Clay essentially stood on three pillars. That is, they wanted a a manufacturing base, that is the physical, the actual industries. They wanted the physical transportation corridors, the roads, the ports, and later on railroads when that came along. And last was a national bank, so the financial aspect. Now the Chinese are doing essentially the same. They're looking also to connect, the greater Eurasian space with technological sovereignty, that is to dominate the key technologies. They're looking at the physical transportation corridors, that is the second pillar, which is the Belt and Road Initiative to connect by sea and land. And the third pillar would be the financial connectivity. So the currencies they trade in, the development banks, the payment system. So, and the Russians are essentially doing the same thing. So this is how I would measure the extent to which the economic, they're able to develop an alternative international economic architecture, which decouples more and more from the US-led one. So, no, I think it's quite clear that the economic power is very quickly shifting to the east, and this fundamentally changes everything. And just as a side note, this was why the toppling of Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014 was such a disaster. This was the one thing the West did when the Russians finally recognized that their dream of a common European home was dead, and they replaced it with what they considered to be Greater Eurasia. Now, this happened exactly at the same time as the Chinese were beginning to decouple from the American-led international economic architecture. That is to develop, they had this China 2025 aspiration to develop key technologies in the world. They really put the Belt and Road Initiative in place in 2013. They developed their own development banks, such as the AIIB in 2015. So, if you look at it in hindsight, this was the worst possible time in history to topple the government in Ukraine, because this was the exact time when an alternative in the East emerged. So, it's not just the Russians and the Chinese. That cooperation has formed a gravitational pull, which you see BRICS and SCO and all these other organizations are organizing around. Anyways, that's a long-winded answer to argue. Yes, the economy is shifting to the east. So.
It's a fascinating answer. Our mutual friend and colleague John Mearsheimer is debating in Toronto tomorrow night the godmother of that overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, not Hillary Clinton, but Victoria Nuland. It's John and his colleague from Harvard, Steve Walt, versus Victoria Nuland and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Is it worth searching the world for monsters to destroy? You can only guess which side Professor Mearsheimer and Professor Walt are on. But back to Europe. What is the EU's relationship, if any, with China?
Well, it's, let's say problematic for a variety of reasons. The first is that as the world becomes more multipolar, the United States would like to, essentially have the Europeans show some geoeconomic loyalties towards the United States. That is to cut themselves off from the Chinese technologies. They're doing this at the same time as they wanted the Europeans to cut themselves off from Russian energy. And this essentially has made the Europeans excessively dependent on the US at a horrible time, because the US is now deprioritizing Europe. So they should have done the opposite. But anyways, in the hope of maintaining the transatlantic relationship, they kind of turned on China. And the rhetoric is also quite hostile, not necessarily at the European state level, but the European Union is extremely hostile towards China. And but also some legitimate concerns. That is when the US and the Chinese began to have this not so amicable divorce. The Chinese had a lot of additional exports to push, and that could have been shifted towards the European markets. And so many of the Europeans were worried that would undercut their own producers, and for this reason, they pushed against the Chinese a bit too hard. And now we see our own economic, not a trade war yet, perhaps, but moving in that direction. The electric vehicles, for example, the Europeans are pushing hard against this. And I guess at the heart of it, the problem for the Europeans, especially over the past 30 years, if not 40, has been the inability to catch up technologically. I remember in the early 90s, the Europeans were worried that they, because they didn't keep the pace with the Americans on digital technologies, they were concerned that they would become a technological colony of the US and Japan. Again, late 80s, early 90s. But now we see that they haven't developed a technological sovereignty, especially in the digital realm. And for this reason, there's a lot of concern about the massive dependence they're developing on the Chinese. And for this reason, they're pushing kind of hard back. And also, if you look in the military area, you have people like Jens Stoltenberg, who was the NATO Secretary General. And he was also making similar points that, we shouldn't make the same mistake with Russia, with China as we did with the Russians. So essentially arguing that it's better to get some distance now and possibly prepare for conflict with the Chinese.
Well, again, China is now no longer selling raw earth minerals to the United States, even though many American munitions and radar systems require it. Do EU countries buy this from China?
There's some restrictions there as well, but I don't think they're as strict as with the US. But the Chinese are putting greater restrictions in place. But that's also, for a variety of reasons. One is that it was a good way of pushing back against the US, especially because of the tariffs. So that's by restricting the rare earth exports, that was beneficial. But it's also, it was beneficial to make Trump step back, but it's also because, the United States and also by extension the Europeans, it's quite likely that they will engage in some kind of military hostilities with China in the future. And again, there's been a lot of aggressive rhetoric from NATO. So it also doesn't make sense for the Chinese to arm their opponents who are possibly planning war against it. And as you said, a lot of these rare earth minerals are required to arm themselves against the Chinese. So all these very expensive radars which have been destroyed in the Middle East now, they all need the gallium. I think the Chinese produce 99% of the gallium, so you can't really build those back without support from the Chinese. If you want artillery, shells, and other missiles, you need antimony. This is also, I think, more, if not 90% or 85-90% from China. So there's a lot of minerals which there's a high dependency on the Chinese. So it's the Chinese essentially don't want to sell the Western rope, which we want to hang them with. And
right. I may have misspoken earlier on Professor Mearsheimer's debate. That debate is tomorrow, May 20th in Toronto. He wasn't sure if it would be streamed. He thought it would be posted somewhere when it's over with. Do the EU elites expect some sort of a quick and violent resolution to the war in Ukraine, or stated differently, do the EU elites think that Russia in general is losing patience with the slow pace of the war?
Well, I think, as I have said many times, my main concern, which is appearing seemingly playing out now, is that as the US is pulling out of the war, putting more on this burden on the Europeans, which can't really afford this anymore, and also the Ukrainians, which are running low on manpower, we have a very dangerous dynamic. That is, the Russians are now desperate to restore their deterrence, that is to push back, hit back against NATO. At the same time, the Europeans have to escalate because of the problems on the battlefield, and the Americans are pulling away. So if you're sitting in Moscow now and you need to restore your deterrence, and the Europeans are escalating and the Americans are pulling back, now is essentially the perfect time to strike back, because the mood in Russia has changed dramatically, as I would say. That is, for the past 4.5 years, the logic has always been, listen, we're winning on the battlefield slowly. If the NATO is escalating a bit against us, let's just let it be, and we'll get the victory at the end. But now the escalations are reaching such levels that it's no longer acceptable. And I'm thinking then primarily about this massive drone attacks now against Russia. This is problematic for many reasons, because the Europeans are very openly saying, we are mass producing long range weapons to strike deep inside Russia. It's the NATO countries that are providing the war planning. They're doing giving the intelligence, picking the targets, helping organizing how they can evade the Russian air defenses. They even have contractors to help operate some of the weapons. So my point is that this is a NATO attack, and they're becoming more and more bold. And the reason why the Europeans are celebrating now is because they're attacking the Russians with such high numbers of drones that a lot of the drones are getting through and hitting targets deep inside Russia, also damaging their energy infrastructure. While the Europeans are celebrating the ability to bring more pain to Russia, what they seem to forget is that you should be careful what you wish for. If Russia is really put in a vulnerable position, they can no longer sit back and essentially take it on the chin or turn the other chin. So I think that you will see now a Russian retaliation, probably incremental, coming against.
I don't know how you would know this, other than the fact that you have your finger on the pulse of this. But do the Germans, do the French, do the Poles, do the British expect their munitions plants to be attacked by Russian missiles?
I don't know. I think they should expect it. I'm not sure what happened. If you make the point in Europe today that they're making themselves targets, you will be purged from polite society because they consider this to be outrageous. But the Europeans themselves only, 3-4 years ago, the reason why they were cautious to send artillery, cautious to send tanks, didn't want to send missiles, was because they knew that would make them participants in this war. So now they are participants in this war, but the debate is all gone. So it's hard to know exactly what they're thinking because no one's allowed to talk about this. If you argue that this is provocative, this has already made Europe a participant in the war, well, they say, well, that's a Kremlin talking point, and your political or journalistic career will be over. So there's no discussion, which is why this is so crazy. The fact that the Europeans are now attacking Russia, attacking Moscow in such a big way, and everyone knows that the weapons comes from the West. They know that the West is providing the intelligence, and but still, there's no discussion about what actually is the consequence of this. So I think they should be considering that the weapon manufacturing plants in the West now will become targets, or more specifically in Europe.
Wow. Professor Deason, thank you very much. It's a rather dramatic. Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter and even Professor Sachs, who's on in a couple of minutes, have been mentioning it as well. But you have been very forthright. If they're not expecting it, they should. Thank you, Professor Deason. All the best to you, my friend. We'll see you again soon.
Good to see you again, Judge. Thanks.
Of course.